Hi, welcome to session 2 of the fourth topic of the semester titled The Slave Trade and the Coming of Slavery in Virginia Colony 1444 to 1740. So again, this is the second session of this topic, and we were in the first session discussing the introduction of slave studies. So we were just going over the practice of servitude, of slavery in the ancient world, how it was actually practiced in ancient times by virtually every society around the world. We're going to see that this was a very pervasive type of practice that existed virtually everywhere, and that every culture, every group, and every civilization practiced slavery in one degree or another, in one form or another, was because it was a form of servitude. So he was discussing that and how religion, religious ideas, religious beliefs, religious ideology served to justify the existence of servitude, because in the ancient world, religion was used to actually justify everything that human societies did and created. All of the institutions of the ancient world, the political institutions, the religious institutions, etc., they were all sustained by religion, and even the social institutions, in which even society was actually subdivided into different groupings, different groups, each one separated by occupation or trade. So we talked about that, and how religion also served to justify, of course, the existence of those groups, those occupations, those trades. And of course, one of those groupings was, of course, servants, what today we just simply call slaves. So they also had a purpose, a mission to fulfill in the religion of those ancient societies. And that is, again, the purpose to serve others in order to serve the gods by serving other people, and so on and so forth. So we were discussing that. And also, we were looking at slavery in the continent of Africa. Again, it was very important to actually assess, of course, the continent of Africa in terms of the practice of slavery or servitude in that region of the world, because this is the region from which most of the slaves are going to be exported into different parts of the world. So we talked about that. That, again, is a very ancient institution, that served to actually build, of course, the greatest civilizations and kingdoms and cities of Africa. And so we were looking at, again, that within Africa, of course, labor itself was considered wealth. It has, of course, one of the greatest values in Africa, as well as cattle. So again, and this is one of the reasons why in Africa slaves or servants were traded. They were sold in slave markets and so on. For thousands and thousands of years, precisely because in African culture, those were the two most valuable resources anybody could actually possess. So we discussed the reasons why, again, in very great depth. And also, we covered in session 1 the rise of the export slave trade, from which, again, we're going to see the arrival of people coming from different regions of the world, particularly in this case from the Middle East. There's going to be Arabs, of course, merchants, Arab traders going into North Africa, the eastern section of Africa as well, for the purpose of trading with the African kingdoms, products that they carried in exchange for slaves. Because what led to the export slave trade, we were talking about that at the end of session 1, was sugar production, sugar agriculture, the rise of the sugar plantation itself. When sugar was commercialized, was taken out of India, the native region of India, it was taken into different regions, again, like in the Middle East, for example, in the Mediterranean Ocean as well. There's going to be a great demand for labor. to actually work in those sugar plantations. And many of those merchants coming from the Middle East, the Arabs, are going to find a scarcity of labor, particularly because this kind of economic activity, the sugar plantation, growing sugar, that is, was actually taking place in very hot and humid environments that were giving people, of course, heat strokes and exhaustion, for example, dehydration, and of course malaria. You know, the disease malaria was also taking a great toll on the Arab populations that were used to grow the sugar, and that led, of course, the Arab merchants and traders to go into Africa in pursuit of that labor to actually grow the sugar, given the fact that, as I explained at the end of session 1, the peoples of Africa, of course, had grown accustomed after thousands and thousands of years of living in certain regions, tropical regions of the world. Okay, so they pretty much develop a kind of resistance, if you will, to the heat of the sun. You know, the people live in the tropics, they're pretty much accustomed to that. They have adapted, if you will. And also malaria had existed in the African continent for thousands of years, that the populations of Africa, having been so much exposed to malaria, had developed a certain degree of immunity. Certain degree. We're not talking about that they were totally immune, but they developed a certain degree of immunity. So again, those were characteristics that the Arabs in this case saw as beneficial in their pursuit of labor that will withstand the rigors again of the sugar growing plantation work. So again, we're going to see the development of slave trails, you know, that again, we're coming again to see the Arabs moving into the northern region of Africa, the eastern section of Africa, and beginning to export the slaves out of Africa. Now, we're going to actually continue our discussion from here. So now let me go back to the outline so we can continue now with our story of the export slave trade again. So we're now looking again in this section, as we have been looking in the end of session 1, at the export slave trade again, that we're going to see now Africa exporting slaves into different regions of the world. In here, what we're going to see is that after the Arabs began to pour into Africa, okay, by the 9th century AD onwards, we're going to see that by the 1300s and 1400s, the Europeans are now moving into sugar economy, and also trying to develop their own sugar plantations to grow sugar for the European market because of trading difficulties, trading relationships that existed between the Europeans and, of course, the Middle East. At this point, sugar production is being monopolized, if you will, by the Arabs in the Middle East. And again, if you wanted to buy sugar, if you're from Europe, you had to actually import it from those sources from the Middle East and buy at higher prices. So it's very precious commodity sold at very high prices. So now what the Europeans are trying to do is actually do away again with that source and trying to grow the sugar on their own in order to sell it within Europe. So this is extremely important because now we're going to see the Europeans developing their own sugar plantations, which over time, this is going to require, of course, also the need for labor, agricultural labor, to work in those plantations, which in turn, as we'll see in just a few minutes down the road, is going to lead again the Europeans to move into Africa as well in pursuit of that labor as well. Okay, so again, sugar is at the very center of the rise of the slave trade. Okay, the export slave trade. Again, sugar. If you really want to pinpoint to identify what was the main reason again that led to the rise of this international slave trade, so to speak, African slave trade, was actually sugar. Okay, sugar production, the commercialization of sugar, growing sugar on a massive scale for exports, because there was now a growing demand for this product. Again, that led for the need of labor, and most of this labor is actually coming out of Africa. Okay, so let's now look at then the rise of those European sugar plantations, so we can see again the development of this process by which Europeans are now moving into this type of commercial activity, and which lead again the Europeans over time to get to Africa for the slave trade as well. Okay, so now in the 1300s, we're going to see the early rise of the European sugar plantations. Now, this was not a massive commercial activity. Okay, this was not a massive commercial enterprise that the Europeans are going to engage in initially. This is going to be a very slow process, again, of change that leads certain Europeans, like for example, there were some Russian landlords, for example, that were very interested in growing the sugar by moving south into the Mediterranean Ocean, the eastern portions of the Mediterranean Ocean, where the regions, for example, today is the present country of Greece, for example, that region, again, what we're talking about, of Eastern Europe. And they're moving into those hot and humid environments. Again, sugar cannot be grown in Europe itself, like in Central Europe, for example, or in Russia, etc., because it's just too cold. The climate is just too cold, has very long winters, and this plant is not going to actually develop in that kind of habitat. It's not its indigenous native habitat, again, that you actually, again, develop for thousands and thousands of years. This plant adapted to a kind of tropical type of climate, subtropical. So, of course, the Europeans must move into those tropical regions in order to grow it. So this is, again, leading the Russians to move south from Russia, moving into the Mediterranean Ocean or Mediterranean Sea. And they're now establishing a series of sugar plantations there in order to grow their own sugar. Now, of course, they need labor, and initially what they're going to do is bring with them their own serfs. Russia was very well known for its serf population, serfs, servants, that is to say. And it is estimated that during this time and in future centuries, it was estimated that anywhere between 70 to 80% of the Russian population were actually serfs. Now, what is a serf? It's really a servant, but it has specific qualities or characteristics when we're talking about European serfs, particularly when we're talking about Russian serfs. In this case, in that the serfs were actually people that were actually in bondage. That is to say, so they were servants and they were serving a landlord, again, not just paying tribute, but the landlord had pretty much, total sovereignty, if you will, over the serfs that worked in his property. But here, the serfs were more part of the land than they were actually part of the landlord's possessions. So when the landlord wanted to transfer, for example, a piece of land to another landlord, he will have to actually transfer the serfs that live in that piece of land along with the land itself that was being transferred to another individual. Okay, they were part of the land, that is to say. So the landlord couldn't just say, "Oh, I'm just going to go to another piece of land. I'm going to take my serfs with me, etc." Again, they were pretty much tied to the land that they actually lived and worked. And that's the only difference, again, from what in the Americas, again, will be known as slavery, for example. That again, slaves could just be bought and sold again as individuals. So now, of course, the Russian landlords that are beginning to move into the Mediterranean Sea to grow the sugar take along with them their serfs, because they said, well, we do have labor, okay, is our serfs. So we're going to take with us, again, as we're actually moving into this land, again, this very hot and humid land to grow sugar, we're going to take some of our serfs to grow the sugar there. And here, we're going to see that in Europe, there will be a specific term that will be used to describe the agricultural workers of those sugar plantations, the serfs, the Russian serfs, and they were actually known as Slavs. Okay, Slavs. Okay, it would be very common in Europe to call a Russian serf a Slav, because the word Slav actually is the term to describe the ethnicity of somebody who comes from Russia. Okay, so Russians are actually part of an ethnic group known as the Slavs or Slavic people, the Slavic or Slavs. So it was, again, very common, to describe the serfs of Russia growing sugar as the Slavs. Oh, the Slavs growing sugar, and so on and so forth. And so this is the root word for the word slave, by the way, that will later be used by the Portuguese and other European groups to describe the servants or the serfs of Africa when they arrived to Africa and they saw that in Africa they also have their own serfs. They'll simply call them Slavs because Russia was very well known to have the largest serf population of all of Europe, the largest by far. And this is a region full of Slavs, they will say, serfs again. And of course, as those serfs are taken into the Mediterranean Ocean, they were simply known as the Slavs. And who are the Slavs? Those are the people that are actually growing sugar. They're serfs, that is to say. So serf and Slav became almost synonymous. To call somebody as a Slav was at the same time to call them a serf, or vice versa. Interchangeable terms, if you will. So much so that when the Europeans, the Portuguese, arrived to Africa and they saw that Africans also traded serfs, they said, oh, they have their own Slavs here. Okay, and so this is the word that will be used to describe, of course, people in servitude, again, status. They're servants, that is to say, or serfs. And again, this is the word that gave us the word in English as slave, okay, or in Spanish, esclavo, that is to say, which was actually eslavo, Slav, in other words, Russian, that is to say, okay. So, again, this is just, again, how things are going to be moving along in this sugar, enterprise, in terms of how the workforce, the agricultural labor is going to arise very early on from people that were in bondage, whether the Arabs are moving into Africa to actually trade, people that were serfs or people that were servants in order to work in those sugar plantations, or, as we'll see, the Europeans bringing their own serfs, like the Russian serfs, again, to grow the sugar, and later on, of course, the Portuguese moving into Africa, of course, in pursuit of that labor as well, for their sugar plantations. So after the Russians came the Portuguese and the Spanish to grow sugar. So the Russians represented the pioneers, if you will, in Europe, moving into sugar agriculture. But by the early 1400s, as that century opened up, we're going to see the Portuguese and the Spaniards also trying to develop their own sugar plantations in the Mediterranean Ocean, and also they're going to be looking at a series of islands located off the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula, what is today, of course, Portugal, and also the northwestern coast of Africa. They're going to be exploring those waters. They're going to be encountering a series of islands, and they're going to actually seize those islands, clear the islands, and actually prepare the land for the development of sugar plantations as well. Okay, so in the early 1400s, we're going to be moving again into now European sugar production by looking at the Spanish seizing the islands called the Canary Islands, and by doing so they're transforming those islands into sugar producing islands as well. And also the Portuguese also are going to seize an island called the Madeira Island, and they're also going to use those islands to grow sugar. Now, if you see here, there's not a lot of land, again, that the Europeans can actually have or use to grow sugar, because there's, again, the kind of climate that is suitable for sugar agriculture is not present in Europe itself. So Europeans must actually move to the south of Europe into the Mediterranean Sea, or seize a few islands of the west coast of Europe, what today is Spain and Portugal, or maybe of the west coast of North Africa, and try to look for islands that will have that kind of climate. Again, the humidity, the high temperatures, and the like, because those conditions are not present in Europe. So again, there's not a lot of land here that is available to the Europeans, even though the Europeans are very eager to go into sugar agriculture, sugar production, because they want to actually, of course, supply that commodity to their own kingdoms, to their own European markets, without relying from, again, importing it from other sources. So again, they're going to actually grow a little bit desperate, as we'll see, that they just don't have the land. In other words, even though they have the motivation, they have the drive to move into this new kind of enterprise, that they just don't have those resources available again. So they're just tiny islands, if you will, that they're using in order to grow the sugar. So it is precisely when the Portuguese are trying to explore the waters of North Africa, looking for more islands. But also remember that the 1400s, this is the century where there's new navigation systems. The Portuguese are experimenting with their new vessels. They're exploring the waters of the Atlantic Ocean of the west coast of Africa, because their aim is to actually circumnavigate Africa in order to reach the Asian markets. They want to actually tap directly to the spice markets of India. They want to reach India and pretty much avoid all the middlemen, of course, of the Middle East. They want to avoid all of that. So it is in the 1400s that the Portuguese, in this case, are every year sending expeditions into the west coast of Africa, trying to actually map that ocean and explore it for the purpose of reaching India. So it is in 1444 that the Portuguese are going to actually make a landing in the west coast of Africa, in the west central coast of Africa, and actually for the first time Um, Going to the mainland of this continent and actually meet and greet the natives populations of the Kingdom of Congo. And by doing so, in 1444, the Portuguese are going to establish a commercial relationship with the Kingdom of Congo. And over time, the Portuguese are going to establish commercial relationships not only with that kingdom but also with a series of other kingdoms as well of West Africa. And for at least a century, the Portuguese are going to monopolize the African trade. Again, that since they were the first ones to arrive to this place and open up commercial exchange with the peoples of West Africa, that they claimed a monopoly, an entitlement again to trade with West Africa. Okay, so this is very important, that how the exploration of West Africa for the purpose of getting to the spices of India led eventually to the European African trade initiated by the Portuguese in 1444. And as I mentioned, they're going to, the Portuguese encounter the leaders, the kings of three kingdoms, and open up commercial relationships with them: the Kingdom of Senegal, the Kingdom of Congo, and the Kingdom of Angola. Okay, let me just move this so you can see it more clearly here. So this is the region again that we're referring to here, the west central region of Africa. There's three kingdoms. The Kingdom of Congo and Angola are together, and the Kingdom of Senegal is just to the north of those two kingdoms. And again, they're going to actually establish now permanent relationships, commercial relationships with the Portuguese. The Portuguese initially here are not that interested in the slave trade per se. They're interested in spices. They're interested in gold. They're interested again in other products. Right now, the need for serfs or servants is not that important. They do, again, have the need to actually grow sugar and have, of course, a steady supply of labor, again, in their Madeira Islands, again, I just discussed. That's true, but this is not a massive enterprise, that requires a massive amounts of labor, of course. So initially, in 1444 and in the decades of the 1400s, the Portuguese, once again, are not that interested, again, in the slave trade per se. When they get to Africa and they begin, this exchange, this trade, there's other things, for example, that they're going to be exchanging initially. Again, there's other commodities, there's other products, again, that are pretty much traded. The Portuguese arrive with certain products and present certain commodities, certain products to the African kingdoms that the African kingdoms either don't have never seen before, or they've seen before but they don't have access to. For example, horses. Okay, the peoples of West Africa, they know about the horse, of course, but this is not, again, an animal species that is abundant or easily accessible to them. And the Portuguese bring, again, one of the most, the best qualities, again, the best breeds of horses of Europe. They actually introduced them to West Africa, and this is a very valuable resource for those kingdoms for transportation purposes. So the horse is going to be used for transportation purposes, but also for warfare, because again, this is very useful whenever, if you're a king, for example, you're the king of Senegal or Congo or Angola, you want to create a kind of armed force that will perhaps be used to uh, defend yourself from your neighbors or deter your neighbors from actually seizing lands or etc. or raiding your communities and so on again. So again, the horse is going to be a very valuable, of course, resource to those kingdoms that would be extremely, very extremely cherished, extremely prized and valuable. This is one of the most, demanded products in West Africa that the kingdoms again of Senegal, Angola, and Congo demand the most. Perhaps is the number one, of course, demanded item. Of course, after that, of course, is the Portuguese introduced weaponry, never, at least at this time, experienced or seen before by the peoples of West Africa, like muskets, so on. Again, they're also going to be introduced at this time as well. Iron and copper is also, again, tools, like skillets, for example, plows, and so on, kitchenware of all kinds, utensils, and so on, made from brass, and so on. Again, all of that will be items that the peoples of West Africa are going to, of course, demand. And it is here that the peoples of Africa are going to give the Portuguese something that they value in exchange. Okay, so the African merchants, the African traders of West Africa are going to now offer to the Portuguese items that they were actually very interested in. They were actually looking for example, peppers. There's a specific variety of peppers grown in West Africa that are quite distinct, different from the peppers that were grown in India, in the spice trade. There's the different taste, the different intensity, different flavor, and so on, different aroma that the African peppers offer. And this is going to be a temporary substitute, so to speak, for these spices that the Portuguese are so much interested in from India. They said, well, yeah, we're going to get to India eventually, but in the meantime, we can use African peppers. And this is something that will find a great market in Europe. By the way, Europeans are interested in spices, so they said, well, the African peppers are going to be a temporary substitute in the meantime. And so this is going to be now imported into Europe in vast quantities. And of course, the African kingdoms are now in the process of trying to produce it in such a massive quantities as well for the Europeans, because they're interested in obtaining horses and muskets, etc., again, from them. So there's going to be the commercialization of pepper, of course, inside of Africa, in the west coast of Africa. There's going to be, of course, a great interest in the ivory trade as well. Europeans are fascinated by the wildlife of Africa. There's a certain mystique of Africa in terms of the plants, the landscape, the wildlife, and so on. Of course, the elephant, again, this is, part of the scenery of Africa. And from the elephant comes, again, the ivory, from the tusk, again, of the elephant. The African peoples have used for many, many centuries, many generations, have actually crafted, the artisans have crafted jewelry for religious purposes, particularly, but also for adorning princes and rulers and so on. People of great status also carry ivory with them. And the Portuguese are going to simply become extremely fascinated at the ivory. Okay, and they also want the ivory because in Europe, people are also going to create, of course, jewelry, artwork from it that will be sold in Europe at high prices. So again, an exotic animal is going to be used to produce an exotic product. Now, think about the furs, for example, of North America. When the French started the fur trade, okay, the beaver was also kind of a mysterious animal that the Europeans have never seen before. And from the furs, again, people are going to craft different type of clothing items. that they consider very fancy, very exotic. So likewise, we're gonna see that, with Africa as well, with the ivory, of course. There'll be a great market in Europe for the ivory. This is why also the Portuguese are coming to the west coast of Africa in the late 1400s and even into the 1500s and beyond, of course. So gold, there's an overabundance of gold in Africa. Okay, gold is abundant, and as I mentioned in session 1, even though gold is abundant in Africa, gold is not used as currency. This is not considered money, in other words, in Africa. What is actually valuable, the source of wealth, etc., in Africa is actually labor and cattle, not land and gold, the way it is in Europe. So gold is used, of course, in Africa to adorn religious temples. This is to adorn the gods and the altars, the shrines, etc., to make them beautiful, to build a very beautiful home, to house their gods, and so on and so forth. The figurines, the statues that they pray to, etc. All of that. That's what gold is used for. It's for religious purposes. So when the Portuguese arrive to West Africa, they're going to become extremely fascinated that, they do have a lot of gold. And they have mined gold for many, many centuries, by the way. And there's an oversupply of it. So this is another thing, again, that the Portuguese, whenever they bring horses, for example, or their muskets, in many cases, they trade those for gold, for African gold, of course. And so they also go there for the African gold that is very easily supplied in great quantities. And also, there's another product that the Portuguese are going to encounter upon in those lands in Africa, in West Africa, and those are the African textiles. Those were actually textiles crafted by hand, by artisans. They were weaving, of course, cloth, and they were producing, of course, things like rugs and mats, also clothing of all kinds with very beautiful designs and so on. That when the Portuguese introduced those to Europe, again, there will be an instantaneous fascination on, again, the African textiles and instantaneous demand. Those are, a growing demand for those African textiles. And this is going to, of course, lead to the mass production, again, of African textiles, whereby the African kings of the kingdoms I just mentioned, what they're going to do is they're going to commission their own artisans to actually produce massive quantities of textiles in a way that this is going to mirror the kind of assembly line mass production of the Industrial Revolution that will come much, much later in the 1700s. Okay, so right here we're not using any machinery of any kind. There's no machines, weaving machines of any kind. It's just people that are actually commissioned on such a massive scale, thousands and thousands, again, of weavers and artisans that will be commissioned to weave those textiles for the king, because what the king wanted was to trade those products for the Portuguese products, okay, to exchange them. So again, this is a very valuable, of course, resource. The textiles, has an aggregate value in Europe, and this is going to lead to more and more commercial exchange, again, not only with the Portuguese, but also the other European groups that will come after the Portuguese to West Africa. There will be later on French, there will be British, of course, merchants arriving in great numbers, and they're also going to be trading again with them as well. And last but not least, initially, as I mentioned, the Portuguese are not that interested in labor at this time because there's not a great demand, okay, for labor. They're interested in labor insofar as they can actually supply, labor to their sugar plantations in this Madeira island, of course. But they're also going to be supplying labor, serfs, that is to say, to the Europeans to do kind of household activities. So it is in Europe that we're going to see, of course, a growing demand for servants in order to do what is called household activities, that is to say. So again, when the Portuguese arrived again to West Africa, they're the ones that are going to coin the term Slavs, because they witnessed that in those markets that they visited, in those kingdoms, when they travel from town, to settlement, and cities and so on, in the interior of those kingdoms, they witnessed that in those markets there were actually serfs or servants that were being traded and bought and sold. So they named them Slavs because this is how they knew, back in Europe. This is the term that it was widely used to describe a person in servitude status could be bought and sold and did work for others. That is to say, the Slavs, the Russian Slavs, they will say, the serfs, that is to say. So they said, oh, they also have their own Slavs here. They have their Slav markets. Okay, so again, this is how the term is going to stick. Is so much that instead of calling them serfs or servants, they're simply going to call them Slavs, and gave us, of course, the English term slave, by the way. Okay, so once again, the slaves were actually, or the servants that were exported out of Africa during this time, they ended up either growing sugar in the Madeira Islands. The Portuguese will actually create markets in Portugal, from which other Europeans are going to arrive to Portugal and actually purchase labor or serfs, African serfs, that is to say. The Portuguese, the Spanish, purchased, of course, serfs, African serfs, to grow sugar in the Canary Islands I just described some moments ago. And also there will be French, there will be Dutch, there will be English merchants arriving to purchase also servants from the Portuguese. Again, so this is in the Kingdom of Portugal, where there's, of course, a market, if you will, from which there's other Europeans arriving in order to purchase, again, the African serfs, that they're being taken into different kingdoms of Europe in order to actually serve households. They're actually helping families raise their children, do household activities, for example, agricultural labor, in farming and so on and so forth. And some actually ended up in high places in the courts of kings, by the way. They became highly educated. Some of them, actually, they learned the European languages, and they lived inside of the courts of the monarchs of different kings across Europe. They learned how to recite poetry for the nobility, play instruments like the violin, and so on and so forth. So not all of them stayed confined to agricultural labor in Europe, that is to say, or serving household activities, but others actually ended up in the royal courts of some kings, by the way, and kind of absorbing the high culture of Europe, so to speak, in a certain sense. So there's so many dimensions, again, of the slave trade that is not so simplistic as to just trying to view it from the lens of, oh, this is just labor for sugar, but rather, when the Portuguese initiate the trade, that's what's not so. The situation is that there's not yet, the massive sugar enterprise, that the Europeans actually are, developing. So therefore, they need a lot of those servants to grow the sugar, and that's all they're doing. Again, initially, that's not the case. So once again, the Portuguese, as I mentioned, again, are simply supplying the serfs in Europe for household duties, agriculture, and the like. There's not, again, yet a great market for it. Again, the slave trade is not central from 1444 to, let's say, 1521. If you look at those two specific years, again, from 1444, when the Portuguese arrived to West Africa, all the way to 1521, there's not, again, a slave trade per se taking place, from which, again, the Portuguese are simply exporting massive quantities of slaves out of Africa to move them into Europe. They were the last in the list, again, of the commodity, so to speak, because during the slave trade, of course, they were viewed as commodities, by the way. That was one of the kind of characteristics, again, or the nature of the trade itself. Again, it was particularly, again, other products like peppers, for example, the ivory that I explained, the gold, the textiles, and the last, of course, that the Portuguese were actually interested was labor. Because there's not a great market for that. Not yet, but this is going to change with the discovery of America. The discovery of America is going to transform the Portuguese slave trade, of course. And this is going to do that in a very significant way. The Portuguese slave trade is going to change so dramatically that by 1521, and that's, of course, at least 2 decades or 3 decades after the discovery of America was made in 1492 by Columbus. So by 1521, when the Portuguese go to West Africa, what they're actually interested, first and foremost, will be labor. Not that they're not going to be interested in gold or textiles and ivory. They're still very interested in that. But again, what their main motivation is, as they're moving into the west shores of Africa, is that they're in pursuit of labor. And the reason for that is because the discovery of America presented a great commercial opportunity to the Europeans, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, who are going to be the forerunners of colonization in the American continent in the 1500s. So the land that the Spanish and the Portuguese were looking for to grow sugar, but couldn't find because it was very limited. In Europe, there's only certain regions where you can actually grow sugar in a significant way. And there's just a couple of islands that the Portuguese and the Spanish had seized in the 1400s to actually grow the sugar there. There was simply the lack, again, of land. Well, that problem has been solved. Okay, in 1492 is the year when Columbus arrives, discovers the New World, the Americas, of course. And after 1492, there will be a series of exploration, more voyages taken by Columbus and others to actually find out that this was a gigantic, of course, landmass that has been found. Okay, and again, as more and more explorers are moving into the mainland in the early 1500s, they're finding out that this is a gigantic, of course, continent, a gigantic continent. So the land that they were actually looking for to move into sugar agriculture has been found. So this gave now the Europeans an upper hand in terms of now using this land for the purpose of establishing massive amounts of agricultural enterprise, what we call plantations, that is to say, in such a massive scale that now they're going to mass produce sugar, not only for the European markets, not just to supply sugar to the Europeans, to the growing demand in Europe for sugar, but really to mass produce sugar, to supply sugar to the entire world. Okay, so the Europeans will be the main suppliers of sugar, again, to the world. By the 16 and 1700s, there was no doubt. 60 to 80% again, of all of the sugar produced and produced that in the world that was consumed worldwide came from the Americas, by the way, from the American continent, produced in one sugar plantation owned by some European power. That is to say, whether it was we're talking about Spain, or we're talking about Portugal, or we're talking about France and England. Again, they're all going to have colonies in the Americas that are going to have sugar plantations, growing sugar in such a massive scale that all of the sugar ended up pretty much around the world. Okay, so the discovery of America changed sugar agriculture. And again, this, of course, in the 1500s entailed that we're going to see the massive expansion in the 1500s, particularly as that century opened up. Now with the knowledge that there is all of this land that needs to be explored, needs to be claimed, needs to be settled, needs to be colonized. And the forerunners of colonizations I explained in an earlier topic were the Spaniards, followed by the Portuguese in the 1500s. They're going to claim large tracts of land, of course, in the Americas. What we're going to look at, of course, is that their main motivation as they're coming to America, whether they're Spanish and Portuguese in the 1500s, is they're looking for land to grow sugar. They're trying to survey the land in order to actually determine the fertility, the soil, for example, the water supplies, the river systems, and the like that could be used in order to develop sugar plantations, of course. And one of the first commercial enterprises that are going to arise in the Americas in the 1500s, and one of the most important, by the way, that will remain in place until the end of the colonial period and beyond, is the sugar plantation itself. There were hundreds and hundreds of sugar plantations created in the 1500s in the Spanish colonies, but also in the Portuguese colonies of Brazil in South America. Of course, again, this is the century of the sugar plantation, so to speak, because again, there will be hundreds of new sugar plantations scattered across the landscape. Again, so when we see, of course, the map here is that the Portuguese established the colony of Brazil in South America, and the colony of Brazil, the Portuguese colony of Brazil in South America, was a gigantic sugar plantation. It consisted, of course, of dozens and dozens of sugar plantations, each owned and administered by a different planter, of course. But in a sense, what the colony represented, it was a gigantic, massive commercial enterprise of the Portuguese, an economic operation in which what they were actually using the colony for was, again, to produce sugar for the world market. And also the Spanish are going to also use portions of South America, particularly the northeastern segments of South America, Central America as well, the Caribbean islands. Without exception, every island of the Caribbean basin is going to be settled and colonized by Spain in the 1500s. So those were initially all Spanish colonies that were producing sugar. So what actually took place in the 1400s in the Canary Islands and the Madeira Islands, in the west coast of Africa, in the west coast of Iberia, in which the Portuguese and the Spanish went there to those islands, cleared the land, and started growing sugar. The same kind of processes is going to now apply to the Caribbean, in which when the Spaniards arrive, they're clearing the land of those islands for the purpose of producing sugar. So So all of the Caribbean islands and also um, the Gulf Coast of South Mexico is also going to be used by the Spanish to grow sugar on a massive scale. So when you look at sugar plantations, for the most part, they're situated near the coastline, because of that subtropical, tropical climate, those conditions that I just mentioned, they're just so essential, again, to the growth of sugar. So they're very near the coastlines for the most part. And then the Caribbean islands, again, that's the perfect environment for sugar production. But also because those plantations needed to have a quick, easy access to the ports, because this is a product that was exported all over the world. So they needed to have an easy, quick access to those ports in order to ship out the sugar. That's why they're located very near to the coastlines as well. It's not just the tropical conditions, but also transportation purposes as well. So what that entailed then is that when the Portuguese, when of course they were trading already in the west coast of Africa, I just mentioned that, of course, previously. So now that the Portuguese and the Spanish are coming to the New World, establishing sugar plantations, this is going to accelerate, of course, the trade between Portugal and Africa, starting in 1521, to the point that what brings now the Portuguese to the west coast of Africa is to pursue labor, serfs, that is to say, that will be taken now to the Americas in order to grow the sugar. So once again, this is another instance where sugar is at the very center of the export slave trade, again, that we have seen for centuries, ever since the 9th century, all the way to the 1500s. Again, sugar has been in the very middle of this process, the need for labor, that is to say. And so there's going to be, during this process, the so-called slave trade, again, peoples moving from West Africa into different regions of the Americas, particularly the regions I just described, the sugar plantations. And this is where we're going to see an increasing presence again of peoples coming from Africa in those regions, so much so that even today, of course, there's a strong heritage again in the populations, let's say, of Brazil, in the Caribbean islands, particularly in the northeast section of South America, Central America as well, in the Gulf Coast of Mexico, in the southern portions of Mexico as well. A strong cultural and ethnic heritage of peoples actually from Africa. Again, African heritage, African culture, from, of course, this particular process, again, of the so-called slave trade, in which there will be, of course, millions, of course, of peoples that will be transferred from Africa to the New World. Initially, again, the initial intent was to grow sugar. So that was the initial intent. Of course, over time, they're going to be engaged also in the Americas in other activities as well. But what is really kindling this export slave trade to the Americas, of course, is the issue of sugar agriculture. Okay, so now sugar. I just want to make a pause here, rather quickly, just to point out how central, of course, sugar will be to the rise of the modern world. Again, so we're tying together several things here. We're tying together the commercialization of sugar with the rise of the export slave trade. That again kind of started with the Arabs back in the 9th century or so, moving to North Africa, East Africa, and so on and so forth. Then followed in the 1300s by the Russians, of course, moving into the Eastern Mediterranean, followed by the Spanish and the Portuguese in the 1400s, and of course the Portuguese arriving to the west coast of Africa in 1444, and connecting now Africa with Europe, again in this commercial exchange, in this growing, of course, mercantile economy, this international trading network system that we have been referring to since the very beginning of the semester. Of course, you know, Africa is now by the 1400s, if you will, plugged to this larger network of international trade. But what's significant is that as the Americas are discovered, we're going to see the massive production of sugar, which of course is taking place with, of course, an increasing supply of labor coming from Africa. So Africa is really supplying the labor, if you will, that is being used to grow the sugar. But what's significant is that because now sugar is being produced on such a massive scale, you know, initially by the Portuguese and the Spanish, as we move into the 16 and 1700s, there will be, of course, the French and the British also engaged in this process, of course, of the mass production. The Dutch will also participate in this, of course, in the Americas, in the mass production of sugar. So what we're going to see is that by the 16 and 1700s, sugar will be one of the most dominant commodities that were produced, consumed, exchanged worldwide. It will become the first mass consumer product again in the world by the 1700s. It was so valuable that it was actually nicknamed white gold, again because of its value. Again, it was a very precious commodity. It was consumed worldwide by virtually, you know, people of all ages, virtually, used in so many different varieties and many different, you know, food preparations and recipes of all kinds, by the way, beverages and the like. So sugar is going to be critical in the making of the modern world. You know, is going to be a commodity that because of its massive production levels that people are going to be engaged in, trying to maximize the production of sugar, trying to produce so much of it because the demand was global, that this is going to lead to the kind of changes that we're going to see in the formation, in the making of the modern world, so much so that, again, this is going to become the first mass consumer food product. Again, something that will be consumed worldwide. The vast majority of the sugar being consumed worldwide is produced in the Americas. Okay, 60 to 80%, at least 60 to 80% of the sugar will be produced in the Americas. Again, so this is going to be very critical for bringing the modern world, because one of the things that is very, very characteristic of the modern world is that when we talk about mass production, we also talk about mass consumption as well. Okay, what we call consumerism. Okay, people consuming something on such a massive scale that is not necessarily something that we have to consume, as a matter of fact. So sugar, we don't actually need it. You know, if we need it in such low quantities, as a matter of fact. You know, actually consuming sugar in such massive quantities can actually be detrimental to human health, by the way. But this is just part of, again, how the modern world is, again, in that we're so much accustomed to consumerism, that is called mass consumption. And why we consume, of course, products in the modern world is because modern societies have a specific value, again, on consumer products. And that value is that they bring happiness, that is to say. Okay, they bring pleasure and they bring happiness. So this is characteristic of modern living. In the modern world, people consume products in such a massive scale because we feel that consuming those products is going to bring us fulfillment, is going to bring us pleasure and eventually happiness. Human happiness comes from consumerism, from consumption. So again, this is going to be critical, again, in the making of the modern world, because sugar will become the first mass consumer fruit product that is going to be seen as, of course, the source of pleasure. We consume that not because we need it to survive, okay? We consume it because it's pleasurable. We like it, in other words. We enjoy it. I enjoy my food, I enjoy my drink, I enjoy my dessert, whatever, when it's sweet. Not because I need it, but because it makes me happy, that is to say. And that is, again, a value. Again, it's a kind of value, materialist value, that is so prevalent in today's world, in the modern world, that sugar becomes one of those first, again, consumer items that is now consumed worldwide, in which people are simply doing it because of the pleasure that it brings. And of course, the practical side is that sugar also was considered to be a source of calories as well. It's not just pleasure. Of course, that's very important. That's very dominant when people actually buy the sugar. The pleasure factor, but also the calorie factor, that people valued sugar also because it actually provided people with energy. That is to say, calories that perhaps were lacking from the other foodstuffs that were available to them, or whenever there were crop failures, scarcity of food, there's not a lot of food to go around. So the substitute will be, well, if you eat some sugar, it will give you the calories you need for you to do work. That is to say, so that's the other thing, again, calories, energy, if you will, gives you energy to do work as well. Of course, with the growing demand for sugar, we're going to see that the massive rise of sugar plantations in the Americas are going to serve as the kind of forerunner for what will become the kind of enterprise so characteristic of capitalism. Capitalism is going to flourish in the 1700s again as an economic system. From the 1700s and onwards, we're going to see the rise of capitalism, of course. And capitalism, of course, is very well known for being a system that fosters the creation of commercial enterprises. That is to say, it's called free enterprise. People owning property to use that property to generate an enterprise in order to build wealth, wealth formation, in other words. So once again, the sugar plantation itself is going to be like the model, if you will, for the future type of capitalist enterprise that will be so central to the rise of capitalism in the 1700s. Of course, the sugar plantation was, of course, a capitalist enterprise because the sugar plantation was not just land that people were simply growing sugar or other commodities like cotton or coffee or tobacco, like luxury items, but rather the sugar plantation was also a kind of factory in a way. Okay, so we're talking about a capitalist enterprise because the sugar plantation was a place from which people were not just growing the sugar cane, but they were also processing the sugar cane into different types of finished products. Okay, the products that were actually packaged in many cases, and then of course exported to the world. So those were actually agricultural factories. Okay, so again, we're going to see here that the sugar planter is going to be running, of course, the plantation is going to be growing the sugar cane, and at harvest time, what's going to happen is that they're going to process the sugar cane into different kinds of finished products. For example, raw sugar. Okay, you can actually extract the sugar with presses. For example, you have machines, you press the sugar cane, you extract the sugar, and you create, like, blocks of sugar, for example, the raw sugar itself. Or you can actually create another product called molasses, which is the sugar syrup. This is the syrup of the sugar cane, and this is a product that was highly valuable for bakery purposes, for doing baking cookies or cakes, etc., pastries of all kinds. The molasses as well, and also rum. You ferment the sugar cane, and you get, of course, fermented sugar cane, which has alcohol, and that, of course, is what rum. Okay, so there's three products you can actually create inside of the sugar plantation. You have a factory there because you have machines, you have presses, you have people actually creating the raw sugar or the molasses that are put in glass jars and so on, or you have wooden barrels fermenting sugar cane and creating rum, of course. So there's many kinds of products that you're actually creating there. So it kind of mirror the sugar plantation, the kind of factory, again, of the Industrial Revolution. This is a place where you have machines, people operating the machines, and you are either weaving cloth, like cotton or wool, and you're actually, manufacturing textiles and so on and so forth. So this is very, very reminiscent of the kind of capitalist enterprise of the Industrial Revolution. The sugar plantation is going to be like the forerunner of that, in a certain sense. So again, there's a demand now for sugar, of course, and there are hundreds of plantations. And as I mentioned, there's going to be a demand for agricultural labor. Now, what's significant to note is that when the Portuguese and the Spaniards arrived in the 1500s to set up their sugar plantations, they did not immediately bring, of course, the African slaves immediately to those sugar plantations. Initially, they believed that the Native American population, in the very initial years and decades after the discovery of 1492 of the Americas, they believed that the Native Americans could indeed be very useful in the growing of the sugar. But very soon, of course, they gave up on the idea that the Native Americans were going to be useful again in this endeavor, in this kind of enterprise. They're going to now come to the realization that Native Americans were an unreliable source of labor because of the higher death rates that were caused due to the epidemics. Okay, because of the epidemics that were introduced in the Americas, there were high numbers, of course, of Native Americans. From 1492 to 1650, it is reported that 90% of the Native American population are going to decrease. They're going to, die as a result of the epidemics. So this is one of the reasons why the Portuguese and the Spaniards are going to give up on Native Americans and instead rely on the imports of African slaves. And also, the other factor is that the Native Americans that did not die and then ended up in the sugar plantations, they actually easily escaped bondage. They ran away, in other words, from the plantation, and they could do so because this is a territory that they knew perfectly well. That is to say, this is a territory that was very familiar to them. They knew where to go, what kind of animal species they could hunt, what kind of plants they could eat if they go into the woods, into the forest, the mountains, etc. This is a very familiar environment, easily escaping bondage, by the way. And also because of the suicide rates, again, it was very well known that Native Americans could easily commit suicide without a second thought, because it was part of their culture that suicide was not necessarily seen as something negative. From the standpoint of Native American religious thought, suicide happens when an individual's journey was being totally obstructed, by some other circumstances that made the journey, if you will, of an individual quite difficult to proceed. And they even had, of course, in their religious worldview, they even had goddesses and gods of suicide and hanging and so on and so forth. So whenever a Native American during this time just found himself or herself pretty much in a situation they couldn't really escape, they couldn't really get away with, they simply just, committed suicide. It was very well known. Again, so this is another, of course, factor that convinced the Europeans that they had to actually, move towards another alternative solution. And the solution is, of course, as I mentioned, importing more and more peoples from Africa. The slave trade is going to intensify in the latter part of the 1500s, and is going to really intensify in the 16 and 1700s as more and more sugar plantations are developed. There's more need for labor, and of course this is going to lead to, of course, the rise of the export slave trade more and more, particularly because what the Portuguese and the Spaniards realized in the 1500s is that, again, the populations of Africa had greater resistance to diseases. Not that they were totally immune, but they had greater resistance. That is to say, also because they were brought into an unfamiliar territory, unlike the Native Americans that were very familiar with the territory, they could escape. That African slaves were brought into a whole new land that they did not know at all. Again, so that did not really deter them from actually to escape the plantation, but that stopped a great many from actually leaving because they did not know where to go. Okay, it's an unfamiliar territory, of course. And those that actually ended up escaping, they were to be very easily identified, again, as escaped slaves, because they were different, distinct from the Native American population, so they could be identified. If you happen to see, of course, an African slave, of course, in the woods or in the mountains, in the landscape, you can actually, again, see that they're not in the plantation, so therefore they had to be running away, that is to say. So again, the kind of physical characteristics, that is to say. So, at any rate, we are now, again, at the end of our topic. This is the end of session 2. When we come back, we're just going to look very briefly at the transatlantic slave trade rather quickly, and then just move into the coming of slavery to Virginia colony. Okay, so this is the end of our discussion, and we'll see you then in session 3. Goodbye.